So today we're going to talk about report writing, which I know is really fun and exciting, but it's a necessary part of the job. We have to be able to articulate what we did and why we did it. The reason this is very important is because pretty much everything that we do as law enforcement officers is subject to litigation. It's either going to be part of a criminal case that we're building against the suspect, that could potentially, lead to many, many years in prison for the individual. And it's also something that even if it doesn't end up putting anybody in jail, it could be challenged and um, we could be sued, if our actions are so egregious so as to warrant such an action. So um, we need to know how to explain not only what we see but what we do. um, and so every encounter that we have has the potential to wind up in court. Majority of cases get plea bargained, and therefore you don't end up testifying other than maybe at a grand jury most of the time. But you don't know necessarily, on any given day, which cases are going to end up going to court, and which ones are going to end up not. And sometimes the reason that those cases end in plea bargains is because the strength of the case, the strength of the report writing, all of that stuff. So um, you need to be able to write a report that actually makes sense and actually has the right level of detail. So by the time you go to court over something, I mean, at the very least, months have passed, if not years. And so the report gives you an opportunity to refresh your memory about the incident, to prepare for testimony. It also gives the prosecution and the defense um, a window into what really happened. you know Now obviously in this day and age, a lot of times there's cameras, so there's body camera footage and things like that to review. But even with that, there are things that aren't caught on camera. There are things that you can, even though it might even be on video, but it doesn't necessarily capture your attention the same way as when you're in person. So there is still a need for detailed and factual reports that both the defense and the prosecution can then review in order to prepare their cases. And so the more detailed and well written your report is, the stronger the case overall, generally. And when you get too vague and general in your report, then you leave a lot of questions on the table, right? Questions that ultimately will be asked, right? So if all you do is say that so and so looked suspicious, or so and so was drunk, or so and so was aggressive, or took an aggressive stance, sooner or later, some defense attorney is going to get you on the stand and say, "What do you mean by this? You know, why did you think that they were drunk? Why did you think that they were aggressive? Why did you think that that they were this way?" And you're going to have to explain it, and months, maybe even years later. And so that's why, it's important. I mean, sooner or later, you're going to get asked the question. You might as well answer it while it's fresh in your mind and put it in the report to begin with. So I've seen examples of this over the years, mostly just, um, mostly just where, they just don't get very specific about what they did. They'll kind of gloss it over. They'll say, well, I assisted so and so to the ground, or after a short scuffle, I regained control of so and so, and it's like, what exactly did you do there? Um, or omitting information in there is also a big deal. You want to anticipate, what the issues are, because sometimes, you know, folks, after consulting with an attorney or whatever, can decide that they were more seriously injured, than they really were. So, what you do to follow up with people who claim to have injuries, whether or not they were seen by EMS, whether or not what you observed in them, before, during, and after the encounter. All of that can be important. So the basic things for report writing that are pretty important is that you are the author of your report. The report is what you did, what you saw, and what you are going to do. So you're going to write it, using I, they, he, she, they. This isn't a research paper. You are writing in first person. You're going to go in chronological order. Every report you ever write is going to start with, on this date at this time, I was at this location and this happened, pretty much, or I responded to this location because of a report of whatever. So, for example, if we're talking about, let's say that I get dispatched to domestic uh, uh, disturbance, and so my report will say, on this date and this time, I responded to this location for a report of domestic violence. And then I might say, dispatch advised that two parties were fighting physically, and the male subject is now leaving in a red Chevy pickup truck with Kansas plates. And so I'm about 3 blocks away from the scene, and I see this red Chevy pickup truck with Kansas plates. And so I decide, I'm going to pull him over, because he's the other half of this domestic. So I go ahead and initiate a traffic stop, while another officer ends up going to the scene, right? And so sometimes it goes like that, right? You were responding to this location, but then, you had a higher priority kind of a deal come up. So it's still the same call. And ultimately, the other officers, in that scenario, the other officer is going to respond and talk to the victim. I'm going to talk to the suspect, and then, I'll detain him. And ultimately, we're going to talk to each other then about, what did, the other officer is going to tell me what she said. I'm going to tell him what he said, and we're going to come to a consensus about who needs to go to jail, and so on and so forth. So every time you write a report, you're talking about past events, so you're going to use past tense, and you're going to try to keep the report focused on what you saw, what you did, what other people saw, what other people did, what you have done, and what you're going to do. And so all of those things, you're going to try not to be passive, and you're going to have to identify the source of information. So you're going to, when you're talking to somebody and they're giving you information, you're going to get sick of starting sentences with, Mr. Smith said this, Mr. Smith told me that, Mr. Smith said this. But it's important that whoever people that read the report later on understand where this information is coming from, because there's a difference between Mr. Smith told me that, this happened, versus I observed this happen, or I know this happened. So what is important, but also how you know it. Spelling, punctuation, all the grammar stuff. It's really important. It can make you look incompetent. If your reports are notoriously bad grammar. And you also want to avoid using technical jargon, because it's not just cops reading the reports, it's judges, attorneys, ultimately even potentially jury members. So try to use plain language. You understand that lay people may read your report, and therefore it needs to be understood what things are. You don't want to just say your naked opinion without any supporting facts. A lot of things, opinion has its place and it's important, but you need to cultivate the ability to actually explain why you think that they're drunk, why you think that they're being aggressive, what are the underlying behavior patterns. And that is really a skill that has to be kind of developed over time. For example, if you've ever, communication is more than just the words you say. You can say something, but the tone of your voice, the inflection of your voice, the mannerisms, your body language, all of that stuff can lead people to believe that you are lying or telling the truth or whatever. And that's more instinctual that we understand that. And it's difficult to actually explain why. Similarly, so and so is being aggressive, so and so is drunk, so and so is example that I can think of. We come to these conclusions for reasons, but sometimes it's, we have to kind of train ourselves to look at why do we feel that way. And it becomes really important, especially when we're talking about situations where we use force, because sometimes people are being aggressive, towards us, even though they have not yet been violent. And so, psychological intimidation and things like that, So you need to kind of develop that opinion. You need to support anything in your report that isn't fact-based. You need to talk about the facts that led you to form the opinion. And at that point, you're kind of painting a picture for people. So the details, vary from circumstance to circumstance. Sometimes weather is a factor, right? If you're talking about a car accident, right? It's important to note whether the roadway is wet or dry, whether there's, what the temperature is, things like that. If somebody's claiming, right, that they hit a patch of black ice and lost control of the car, and you note that the outside ambient temperature is 45 degrees, well, wait a minute. I don't think there's black ice right now. So that can be a relevant detail. But if we're talking about, we just take a general theft report, burglary report, the weather usually isn't relevant, unless we're talking about there's 6 inches of snow on the ground or whatever, and then we can follow the bad guy's footprints away from the broken window where he left the house, maybe then it's relevant. But that's what we're talking about. Most people make the mistake of not having enough detail in their report. It's usually not the other way around, but it's also, you can carry it too far. You really don't have to make every report into a thesis, but you do want to make sure that you have things, especially things that you know that are relevant to the case and that you're going to be questioned about. So if you used force, and you use really vague and general terms to describe what you did. Well, after a short scuffle, I had, I was able to get Mr. Smith into handcuffs or whatever. Well, what does a short scuffle mean? That's a question that a defense attorney might ask later on down the road. Exactly what is a short scuffle? Right? It's more important for you in that situation to actually describe more specifically what you did. And sometimes, these things get kind of messy. I understand that. But at the same time, there's got to be a better way to describe it than that. Even if you didn't use, specific control holds or anything like that on them, I mean, are we talking about a scuffle as in a wrestling match? Are we talking about a scuffle as in, actual punches thrown? Are we talking about, did you end up on the ground? Did you stay upright? These kinds of questions, or what would be asked if you end up, testifying on the matter, or being sued on the matter. And it's better for you to have them down in the report to begin with than it is for you to have to try to remember it, months and years later. So it needs to be complete, clear, concise, and accurate. Certainly the accuracy is important. Lies and omissions. I mean, here's the thing. If you make a mistake in your report, and it makes you look stupid or whatever, or incompetent or whatever, that's bad enough. But if you get caught in a lie, or if you leave something out on purpose because it's, either exculpatory evidence that might point to the defendant's innocence, or that you omit it because it makes you look bad, and it's really just kind of game over at that point. So I do want to actually get a couple of examples here about that issue. One of them is Michael Slager. He's the guy that shot. He was on a traffic stop, and the suspect ran away. He chased him down. They had a scuffle. At some point during the scuffle, the cop's taser comes off of his belt. It's unclear as to the circumstances of that, whether the cop was trying to draw it and dropped it, or whether the guy took it from him and dropped it, but whatever. He shot this guy in the back as he's running away. And he wasn't able to articulate a reasonable threat, right? Well, for shooting this guy. That's bad enough, right? And that probably would have still been fired, sued, all this other kind of stuff. But ultimately what he did, in the immediate aftermath of the shooting, was to see, oh crap, my taser's right there on the ground right next to me. He didn't have it. And so he bends over and picks it up and goes and drops it near the body so that it looks like he did have the taser. And that's just not acceptable, right? And he was, some bystander ended up recording video of it, and ultimately he ends up getting convicted of murder and sentenced to 20 years in prison. The primary reason that he had such a steep sentence was because he perjured himself, right? He discredited himself. So when he claims, right, that he thought that this guy had his taser when he was shooting him in the back, he was running away. I would still say, absent any kind of turning of the suspect or seeing the weapon, I still don't think that justifies shooting him in the back as he's running away. However, when he lied, moving the evidence and trying to to change it, he basically communicated to all that he's willing to do whatever it takes, to get out from under being in trouble, right? And so now you can't really believe anything that he says. And that's the worst thing that you can lose is credibility. There's also a more local example. Doesn't involve murder, but here in Marshall, a few years ago, a couple of cops, they go to serve an arrest warrant on a suspect. The suspect ends up forcibly resisting. He's in a car and he starts to drive away. One of the cops shoots one shot at the car as it's going away, doesn't hit it. So they do this big manhunt. And I remember when this happened, because the officers claimed that, like he pulled one of them into the car with him and he had a gun in his hand and he put it to the officer's head and pulled the trigger and it went click, no bang. And then, he ended up getting away, or he ended up letting go of the cop, and the cop fell out of the moving car, and, the suspect took off, and they ended up tracking him down to Arkansas or something like that, arresting him and extraditing him back. And they had all these charges on him, attempted murder and everything else. Well, when they're preparing for trial, the prosecutor notices that, when he's reviewing the video, because this happened in Walmart, the parking lot of Walmart. So there's cameras, and they noticed that that officer was never anywhere near inside the car. And so it exposed the fact that this officer lied in his report. And the other officer, who was also at the scene but didn't actually fire a shot, also claimed to have seen this gun. And it was a big story, obviously. And it even kind of didn't go national, but it went regional. And ultimately they ended up dropping charges on this guy and everything else, and the prosecutor wrote a very scathing letter, press release, where he said that he will never again file any charges in which those two officers are involved. Once you have, destroyed your credibility, you're no longer a credible witness, not only in that case, but in any case. So it's important, whatever you do, don't lie in your reports. You might be able to get away with it. But man, the cost is high if you don't, and it's higher than if you just owned up to it, So I'll give you an example. There's another officer around Minneapolis. I forget, it's like Brooklyn Center, I think is the name of the town. And it was right, at the height, right before the trial concluded against Derek Chauvin. And this officer was involved in a use of force incident, and she intended to draw her taser. She accidentally drew her firearm. She even said taser before she actually shot the guy. She made no attempts to try to lie or cover up or try to do anything. She just said what happened, so, unlike this other officer, she didn't get charged with murder. She got charged with manslaughter, and I'm not sure how. I don't think that case is concluded yet, so I don't really know. But it's not to say that telling the truth that you're not going to face consequences, but at least you maintain some credibility there, and it should not be as bad, for you, so just remember that. So we use the report, obviously, to document the case. It's used by the prosecution to prepare for trial, and then it's given in discovery to the defendant, so that their attorney can prepare for trial. And that's where, if the attorney sees your report, sees the holes in it, the omissions, he might decide to, beat you up on the stand over it. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't, but it's completely unnecessary. If you just put the detail in your report to begin with, then there's nothing new under the sun. There's nothing new to add. They can, you know, try to bicker with you about details, but ultimately, if all of the major, things are in there, there really isn't anything for them there. You need to be taking notes at the scene. If you're going to put together a good report, you're going to have the detailed information, the names, and particular, personal information or whatever about the people involved. So the reporting party, any witnesses, your suspect, your victim, all of these people need to be identified as applicable, and they also, should be, interviewed. And so you're going to have to keep track of all of that information. And so, generally speaking, when I'm taking notes, the first thing I try to do is identify, people, and then I actually, make notes about what they say. And my notes are not, narrative style. It's just little bits to jog my memory, key things. And ultimately, if we have, somebody, we ask them to make a statement or whatever, they'll come in and actually write it out in their own words. There is some good help, nowadays with the body cameras and stuff. Sometimes you can go back and review, so you can give a more accurate account of things. But ultimately, you still have to be pretty self-reliant, because you don't have time to review every second of every body camera, thing, whenever you have a backlog of cases and stuff like that going on. Not to mention the fact that it can be tempting sometimes to rely on the dispatch log for things, but remember, your dispatchers are human beings too. And sometimes they make mistakes, sometimes they get behind, sometimes they omit things, So when you're talking about important events, you really should be getting in the habit of noting the time. What time did you speak to with the suspect? What time did you do Miranda, for example? You still call it out on the air, and there's still a record generated there, but 1805 Miranda or whatever, or 0830 Miranda, whatever the time is, just note it in your notes. Then you have it, there. And so the major parts of your report are, can be separated by subheadings. This is kind of something I didn't used to do, and now I have started doing. And it is, I feel like anyway, it is, it is easier to read whenever the different parts of your report actually have headings in. So your source of activity, in other words, how were you made aware of the incident? If we're talking about a call that you were actually sent to dispatch to, then generally it goes like, well, how I described that domestic, thing earlier, on this date and this time, I was responded to this location for whatever the type of call is, a burglary report, or a missing persons report, or a domestic, or a disturbance, or, whatever it is. And then, anything else the dispatcher tells you, can also be included up there. Anything you learn about prior to arrival. And then on the observations narrative section, that's kind of the bulk of your report, right? That's what happens when you got there. So I arrived on scene, I made contact with the reporting party, whatever his name is, and he said this. And so then I went and talked to the victim, and they said that. And then I went and talked to the suspect, and they said something else. And I came to the conclusion that, the suspect was full of crap. And so I arrested him, that kind of thing. You can also have subheadings for the evidence that you seized, people that got arrested, that kind of stuff. It really kind of helps. Most of your report is going to be what they call a narrative style, which means you're going to actually write in complete sentences, right? However, there are some things that can be taken care of with like a bulleted list or a numbered list. So if you're talking about like a burglary report, you might have a itemized list of things that were stolen, you know, and that's just makes it easier to read and refer to, and then it also, concisely, does it. You could you put that in sentence form and in paragraph form? Yes, you could, but it's a whole lot better that way. This isn't a research paper. You can, do what makes it better. Sorry. It's very likely, that you're going to end up having a primary report that you write within a day or two of the incident. And then you may have to go back and write what they call supplemental reports, because you don't want to wait and hold off until you have the whole case solved, right, to write your report, because, that's a lot of time for things to be up in the air. And unless we're talking about a critical incident kind of a deal where you yourself are kind of put in a fight or flight mode or whatever, the sooner you write this, the better. While it's fresh in your head, while you still remember the details, and also just in case there's something maybe missing from your notes, it's better that you become aware of that sooner rather than later, and take steps to remedy it. So, if you forgot to get the details on, the victim, for example, the particulars are on them, and you realize it later on the same day, you can go back out and get that information, or maybe you can talk to one or two of the other officers at the scene and hopefully one of them got it, that kind of thing. So you definitely don't want to put off doing an initial report. So, generally how it works, in a complex case or whatever, is that you'll write a report about what you did at the scene, and then you'll kind of conclude it with, uh, investigation continues, or more to follow after further investigation, something along those lines. And then whenever you have something to add, you'll do it. So if we're talking about, for example, something where you got evidence that goes to the crime lab, right? Whatever it is, whether it's drugs or whether it's a rape kit or whatever, obviously you aren't going to know the results of that for some time. So you're going to have a case report that doesn't have any information other than that was sent to the lab. Then at some point, weeks, months later, you're going to get this report back. And at that point, you're going to do a supplemental. You're going to add the information that you know. And that's going to allow you to, keep building it. Likewise, every officer who's actually at the scene doesn't necessarily have to write a report, because sometimes more people show up than what we need, or their only involvement in your thing is scene security, for example. They're just sitting there with a clipboard at the door noting who came and went from the crime scene. Do they really need to write a report about that? No, probably not. But if they're handling evidence, particularly, they need to be, doing a supplemental about that. Or if they had meaningful involvement, if they used force on somebody or whatever, they're going to want to write a report on that. Anything that might require them to give detailed testimony down the road, they're going to want to get a story down on paper so that they're not trying to remember what they did. So and this can also be an uphill battle with some people, trying to get them to write a report. You know, um, I kind of went, I kind of had an issue one time, and it was actually my own supervisor who handled evidence, and so um, a few days later or whatever, he asked me about the status of the report, and I said, well, I'm just waiting on your supplemental. And he's like, what? Yeah. So um it's not always universally practiced, but if somebody who should write a supplemental doesn't write a supplemental, it could bite them in the ass, and it could hurt your case, depending upon what they did, and so it's just always a good idea to ensure that it gets done. So ultimately, with respect to report writing, you just kind of have to do it and fumble your way through it a few times and get, with some feedback. uh, Different departments are going to have different expectations to some extent about that. I've had particular supervisors that were very focused and very good at looking over reports and giving you, feedback on it and forcing you to make corrections. And then I've had supervisors that were pretty much didn't read your reports, I don't think, at all, and they just kind of rubber stamped it. So that's where we're at. We're going to have a scenario assignment that's going to um, be kind of your first stab at writing an actual narrative report. And my intention then is to give feedback on that and, kind of move forward from there. So have a good fall break, and I'll see you next week.